Notice how your body tenses when someone seems displeased with you. Watch how your mind scrambles to figure out what you did wrong, how you can fix it, how you can make them like you again. Feel how your entire sense of self shifts based on whether the person across from you is nodding in approval or frowning in disapproval. This isn't love or care. This is psychological slavery disguised as social consciousness. You've become dependent on other people's validation, and like any compulsion, it's slowly destroying the very thing you're trying to protect, your authentic self. Every time you shape your words to avoid disapproval, every time you suppress your real thoughts to maintain harmony, every time you sacrifice your truth for someone else's comfort, you hand over another piece of your freedom to the drug of external validation. Karen Horney, the pioneering psychoanalyst who exposed the hidden mechanisms of neurotic dependency, understood that approval-seeking is one of the most socially acceptable forms of self-destruction. Unlike other compulsions that society recognizes as problems, the need for constant validation gets disguised as being considerate, mature, or emotionally intelligent. But underneath this respectable facade lies a compulsion that's just as devastating as any substance dependency. This compulsion doesn't announce itself with obvious symptoms. You don't wake up in alleys or lose your job. Instead, you lose something far more precious. You lose yourself, one compromised decision at a time. You become a shapeshifter, constantly molding your personality to fit whatever you think others want to see. You develop an exquisite sensitivity to social cues while becoming completely numb to your own inner signals. The cruelest part is how this dependency masquerades as virtue. Society rewards people who prioritize others' comfort over their own authenticity. We praise those who never rock the boat, never cause conflict, never make anyone uncomfortable with their truth. But this social approval comes at a devastating cost. The complete erosion of your capacity to know who you are when no one is watching, what you want when no one is influencing you, and what you believe when no one is validating you. The hunger for approval doesn't begin with a conscious decision to surrender your autonomy. It starts with the seemingly innocent desire to be liked, accepted, and included. But this innocent desire, when left unchecked, evolves into a sophisticated psychological system where your entire sense of self becomes dependent on external validation and your freedom becomes collateral damage. The architecture of people-pleasing is built on a foundation of hypervigilance, an exhausting state of constant attention to other people's emotions, reactions, and potential judgments. You develop an almost supernatural ability to read micro-expressions, detect subtle shifts in tone, and anticipate what others need from you emotionally. This skill feels like emotional intelligence, but it's actually emotional servitude. Consider how this hypervigilance operates in your daily life. You walk into a room and immediately scan for signs of approval or disapproval. You monitor conversations for moments when you might have said something wrong. You replay interactions obsessively, searching for evidence that you've maintained others' positive regard. You've become a full-time emotional meteorologist, constantly checking the social weather to determine how you should behave. This constant monitoring creates what psychologists call external locus of control, a psychological state where your sense of worth, safety, and identity depends entirely on factors outside yourself. You can't feel good about yourself unless others are demonstrably pleased with you. You can't trust your own judgment unless it's been validated by external authorities. You can't even know what you want unless you first know what others want from you. The compulsive aspect reveals itself in how you respond when approval is withdrawn or threatened. Like someone facing withdrawal from any dependency, you experience anxiety, panic, and desperate attempts to restore your supply. You might apologize excessively for unclear transgressions. You might alter your behavior dramatically to regain someone's favor. You might even sacrifice important relationships or opportunities rather than risk disapproval from the people whose validation you crave most. Watch how this dependency shapes your decision-making process. Before choosing what to wear, you consider who might see you and what they might think. Before expressing an opinion, you calculate whether it will be well received. Before pursuing a goal, you evaluate whether others will approve of your choice. Your life becomes a democracy where everyone else gets a vote except you. The most insidious aspect of approval hunger is how it convinces you that this external dependence is actually consideration for others. You tell yourself you're being kind by suppressing your authentic reactions. You believe you're being mature by avoiding conflict. You think you're being wise by letting others guide your choices. But this isn't consideration, it's self-abandonment disguised as social consciousness. This dependency creates a peculiar form of suffering where you're simultaneously surrounded by people and completely alone. You have countless acquaintances who approve of the version of you that you perform for them, but no one knows the person you actually are because you've forgotten how to be authentic. You've traded genuine connection for widespread approval, and the loneliness of this exchange is devastating. But the cruelest irony is that approval seeking doesn't even deliver the security it promises. Because your sense of self depends on others' approval, you live in constant fear of losing it. Every relationship becomes a potential threat to your psychological survival. Every interaction becomes a test you might fail. The very thing you crave becomes the source of your deepest anxiety. This creates a psychological trap where the harder you work to secure approval, the more anxious you become about losing it. And that anxiety makes you work even harder to maintain others' positive regard, creating a cycle that becomes increasingly exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. What begins as normal human needs for connection, recognition, and belonging can transform into neurotic compulsions that imprison your authentic self. These neurotic needs, as clinical research reveals, operate like psychological parasites. They appear to serve your well-being while actually consuming your freedom, authenticity, and capacity for genuine satisfaction. The transformation from healthy need to neurotic compulsion occurs when your survival strategy becomes your identity. The child who learned to gain safety through being agreeable becomes the adult who cannot tolerate disagreement. The young person who discovered that achievements brought love becomes the adult who cannot rest without constant accomplishment. The individual who found that helping others guaranteed acceptance becomes the adult who cannot say no without feeling existentially threatened. These neurotic needs create what researchers call false self-systems, elaborate psychological structures built around what you think you need to be to deserve love, safety, and belonging. The false self is incredibly sophisticated, often more charming, more accomplished, and more likable than your authentic self. But it's also exhausting to maintain because it requires constant performance and vigilance. Consider the neurotic need for perfection. This isn't the healthy desire to do well or improve your skills. This is the compulsive drive to never make mistakes, never show weakness, never appear less than completely competent. The perfectionist lives in constant terror of being revealed as flawed, human, or struggling. They would rather not try at all than risk trying and failing visibly. The neurotic need for control manifests as the compulsion to manage other people's emotions, reactions, and opinions of you. You become hyper-responsible for everyone else's comfort while becoming completely irresponsible for your own well-being. You learn to anticipate problems that haven't happened, solve conflicts that don't exist, and manage emotional states that aren't yours to manage. Then there's the neurotic need for invulnerability, the compulsion to never need anything from anyone. This need disguises itself as independence and strength, but it's actually the terror of depending on others who might disappoint or abandon you. The invulnerable person gives constantly but receives reluctantly, helps everyone but asks for help from no one, and maintains relationships while remaining emotionally untouchable. These neurotic patterns operate like compulsive behaviors because they provide temporary relief from anxiety while creating greater anxiety in the long term. When you successfully maintain your perfect image, control others' reactions, or prove your invulnerability, you experience a brief sense of safety and control. But this relief is temporary and requires increasingly larger doses to maintain. The tragedy of neurotic needs is how they prevent you from experiencing genuine satisfaction. When you achieve something to gain approval rather than for personal fulfillment, the achievement feels empty. When you help someone to maintain your image as helpful rather than from authentic care, the helping feels hollow. When you agree with someone to avoid conflict rather than from genuine alignment, the agreement feels meaningless. Karen Horney's research showed that people trapped in neurotic need systems often report feeling successful but not satisfied, accomplished but not fulfilled, surrounded by people but profoundly lonely. They've optimized their lives for external validation while losing touch with internal guidance. They know how to be impressive but not how to be happy. They've mastered the art of being needed while forgetting how to simply be. But here's where the prison becomes visible. These neurotic needs are insatiable. No amount of approval satisfies the neurotic need for approval. No level of control eliminates the anxiety that drives the need for control. No degree of independence resolves the terror that creates the need for invulnerability. You're chasing a moving target that retreats every time you approach it. The neurotic need system also creates what psychologists call emotional anesthesia. You become so focused on managing external outcomes that you lose access to your own feelings, desires, and authentic responses. You know what you should feel, what you're supposed to want, what others expect from you, but you've forgotten what you actually experience when you're not performing for an audience. Your entire existence has become a carefully orchestrated performance where you're simultaneously the actor, director, and audience, constantly monitoring your own behavior to ensure it meets the approval standards you've internalized. This isn't occasional social consideration. This is the complete transformation of your life into theater, where authenticity becomes impossible because every moment is calculated for its effect on others. The social performance complex operates through what researchers call impression management, the exhausting process of constantly curating your image, words, actions, and even thoughts to maintain others' positive regard. You develop multiple personas for different audiences: the professional self, the family self, the friend self, the romantic self. Each persona is carefully crafted to maximize approval in its specific context, but none of them represent who you actually are. Watch how this performance mentality affects your most basic interactions. Before answering a simple question like, "How are you?" you quickly calculate what response the other person wants to hear. Before sharing an experience, you edit it to make yourself appear more sympathetic, more successful, or more relatable, depending on your audience. Before expressing preferences, you consider whether your authentic choices will make others comfortable or uncomfortable. The performance complex creates what clinical studies call cognitive load. Your brain becomes so occupied with managing impressions that you have little mental energy left for creativity, spontaneity, or genuine connection. You're running multiple programs simultaneously, monitoring others' reactions, adjusting your behavior in real time, predicting what response will be most well received, and suppressing any authentic reactions that might disrupt the performance. This constant performance requires you to develop what amounts to an internal surveillance system. You monitor your own words before they're spoken, your facial expressions before they're displayed, your emotional reactions before they're felt. You become your own harshest critic, immediately catching and correcting any behavior that might threaten your carefully constructed image. The most devastating aspect of the social performance complex is how it prevents you from forming genuine relationships. When you're always performing, others can only relate to your performance, never to your authentic self. When others are relating to your curated image rather than your real self, their approval feels hollow because you know it's based on deception. But you become trapped because revealing your authentic self feels impossible after years of performance. The performance complex also creates what researchers call approval anxiety, a persistent fear that you'll say or do something that will cause others to withdraw their positive regard. This anxiety becomes so pervasive that you begin to avoid situations where you can't control others' impressions of you. You decline invitations where you might appear awkward. You avoid conversations where you might disagree. You refuse opportunities where you might fail visibly. Consider how the performance complex affects your relationship with success and failure. Your achievements feel empty because you know they were pursued for approval rather than authentic fulfillment. Your failures feel catastrophic because they threaten not just your goals, but your entire system of gaining love and acceptance. You become dependent on external validation while losing all capacity for internal satisfaction. But here's the most chilling realization. The performance complex eventually becomes so automatic that you forget you're performing. The personas you've created to gain approval begin to feel like your real self. You lose track of what you authentically think, feel, want, or believe because you've been performing for so long that the performance has replaced the authentic self entirely. This creates a terrifying psychological state where you no longer know who you are underneath the performance. You've become so skilled at being what others want that you've forgotten what you want. You've become so good at managing others' impressions that you've lost touch with your own genuine impressions of the world around you. You've unknowingly appointed yourself as the emotional thermostat for everyone around you, constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of others and adjusting your own behavior to keep them comfortable, even when this means betraying your own emotional needs and authentic responses. This role feels like emotional intelligence, but it's actually emotional servitude that systematically erodes your capacity for genuine feeling. The emotional thermostat operates through hyper-responsibility for others' emotional states, coupled with hyper-responsibility for your own emotional well-being. You become exquisitely attuned to subtle shifts in others' moods, while becoming completely disconnected from your own feelings. You can detect when someone else is slightly irritated, mildly disappointed, or vaguely uncomfortable, but you can't identify your own emotions unless they reach crisis levels. Watch how this dynamic plays out in your relationships. When someone you care about seems upset, you immediately assume responsibility for their emotional state and begin working to restore their comfort. You apologize for things you didn't do wrong. You modify your behavior to accommodate their mood. You sacrifice your own needs to address theirs. You become a one-person emotional emergency response team, always on call to manage others' psychological comfort. This emotional caretaking creates what psychologists call enmeshment, a psychological boundary violation where you cannot distinguish between your emotions and others' emotions, your responsibilities and others' responsibilities, your problems and others' problems. You absorb others' stress as if it were your own. You feel guilty for others' disappointments as if you caused them. You take responsibility for others' happiness as if it were your job. The emotional thermostat role requires you to develop sophisticated emotional regulation skills, but you use these skills exclusively in service of others. You become an expert at de-escalating tension, soothing anxiety, managing conflict, and maintaining harmony. But you never learn to use these same skills for your own emotional well-being because you've been taught that focusing on your own needs is selfish. Research reveals that this emotional caretaking often stems from early experiences where your emotional needs were not just unmet but actively punished. You learned that expressing authentic emotions created problems for the adults around you, so you developed the survival strategy of managing their emotional comfort to ensure your own safety. This strategy worked in childhood, but becomes a prison in adulthood. The most insidious aspect of being the emotional thermostat is how it prevents others from developing their own emotional regulation skills. When you constantly adjust your behavior to maintain others' comfort, they never learn to manage their own emotional states. When you take responsibility for their feelings, they become dependent on your emotional labor to feel stable. You enable others' emotional immaturity while exhausting yourself in the process. This dynamic also creates what researchers call emotional inflation, where minor emotional fluctuations in others trigger major behavioral adjustments in you. Someone else's slight annoyance becomes your emergency. Someone else's mild disappointment becomes your crisis. Someone else's momentary discomfort becomes your responsibility to fix. You live in a constant state of emotional hypervigilance, ready to respond to others' emotional needs at a moment's notice. If this exploration of social performance and emotional caretaking is revealing the exhausting reality of your own approval dependency, if you're recognizing how much energy you spend managing others' impressions and emotions, subscribe now. Because what comes next will show you exactly how this compulsion operates at the deepest psychological level and why breaking free requires more than just deciding to care less about what others think. The emotional thermostat role prevents you from experiencing your own authentic emotional responses because you're so busy managing others' emotions that you have no psychological space left for your own feelings. When something genuinely upsets you, your first instinct isn't to process your own emotion, but to consider how your upset might affect others and adjust accordingly. You've learned to suppress your authentic responses to maintain the emotional equilibrium of your relationships. The thought of being completely authentic, expressing your real thoughts, showing your genuine emotions, making choices based solely on your own desires, triggers a level of anxiety that feels existential. This isn't social anxiety about embarrassment or judgment. This is a deeper terror that authenticity will result in complete rejection, abandonment, and psychological annihilation. This terror of authenticity develops because you've learned to equate acceptance with survival. Somewhere in your psychological development, you absorb the message that who you really are is unacceptable, dangerous, or threatening to others. You discovered that your authentic self created problems, caused disapproval, or generated conflict. So you learn to hide your real self and perform a more acceptable version to ensure your psychological survival. The anxiety of authenticity manifests as a persistent fear that if people knew who you really were, your actual thoughts, feelings, desires, and struggles, they would withdraw their love, support, and connection. This fear becomes so powerful that you'd rather live as a stranger to yourself than risk the possibility of being known and rejected. You choose the certain loneliness of hiding over the uncertain possibility of authentic connection. Behavioral science shows that people with approval dependency often develop what researchers call authentic self-phobia, an actual fear of their own genuine thoughts, feelings, and desires. You become afraid of your own anger because it might displease others. You become terrified of your own needs because they might burden others. You become anxious about your own opinions because they might create conflict. Your authentic self becomes the enemy that threatens your social safety. This phobia of authenticity creates what psychologists call emotional numbing. You become so disconnected from your genuine responses that you genuinely don't know what you think, feel, or want in any given situation. When someone asks for your opinion, you experience genuine confusion because you've learned to suppress your authentic responses so consistently that you can no longer access them quickly or easily. The anxiety of authenticity also generates what researchers call anticipatory rejection. You reject yourself preemptively to avoid the possibility of others rejecting you. You criticize your own thoughts before expressing them. You minimize your own needs before anyone has a chance to ignore them. You apologize for your existence before anyone has indicated that your presence is problematic. You become your own harshest critic to beat others to the punch. Watch how this anticipatory rejection operates in your daily life. Before expressing a preference, you explain why it's not important. Before sharing an accomplishment, you downplay its significance. Before asking for help, you apologize for being needy. Before setting a boundary, you justify why it's necessary. You've learned to reject yourself so consistently that you've forgotten what it feels like to simply exist without apology. The terror of authenticity often intensifies in close relationships because intimacy increases the stakes of potential rejection. The closer someone gets to your real self, the more dangerous it feels to let them see who you actually are. So you work even harder to maintain your acceptable image with the people you care about most, which creates the paradox of feeling loneliest in your closest relationships. Karen Horney understood that this anxiety also creates what psychologists call imposter syndrome. The persistent feeling that you're deceiving others about who you are and that eventual discovery is inevitable. You feel like a fraud in your own life because you are performing rather than being. You live in constant fear that others will discover you're not as competent, confident, or capable as you appear. But this fear stems from the fact that you actually are deceiving others by hiding your authentic self. The anxiety of authenticity becomes self-perpetuating because every time you choose performance over authenticity, you reinforce the belief that your real self is unacceptable. Every time you suppress your genuine response to maintain approval, you strengthen the neural pathways that associate authenticity with danger. Every time you choose others' comfort over your own truth, you deepen the conviction that who you really are is a threat to your relationships. But here's what approval seeking doesn't want you to discover. The anxiety of authenticity is almost always worse than the actual consequences of being authentic. The rejection you fear rarely occurs, and when it does, it usually reveals that the relationship was based on your performance rather than genuine connection. The people who reject your authentic self are the same people who were never really connected to you anyway. They were connected to your image. The more desperately you seek approval, the more likely you are to behave in ways that actually generate disapproval, criticism, and rejection. This isn't because you're inadequate or because others are cruel. It's because approval-seeking behavior itself is inherently unattractive and triggers negative responses in others, even when they don't consciously understand why they're reacting negatively. This paradox occurs because validation hunger makes you behave in ways that violate fundamental principles of authentic human connection. When you're constantly calculating how to gain others' approval, you're not actually present with them. When you're managing your image instead of being genuine, others sense the manipulation, even if they can't articulate it. When you're performing rather than being authentic, others feel like they're relating to a character rather than a person. Carl Jung's research on human psychology revealed that people have an unconscious ability to detect inauthenticity, even when it's skillfully performed. This detection triggers what psychologists call uncanny valley responses, a feeling that something is off, artificial, or manipulative, even when the behavior appears perfectly appropriate on the surface. People begin to distrust you without knowing why, feel uncomfortable around you without understanding the source of their discomfort. The desperation inherent in approval seeking also creates what researchers call emotional labor debt. Others begin to sense that your niceness, helpfulness, or agreeableness comes with hidden expectations and obligations. They feel the pressure of your need for their validation, and this pressure makes them want to withdraw rather than engage. Your hunger for their approval becomes a burden they don't want to carry. Watch how this operates in practice. The person who agrees with everything never gets asked for their real opinion because others sense their responses are calculated rather than genuine. The individual who's always helpful never receives authentic gratitude because others can feel the neediness underneath the giving. The person who never creates conflict never gets included in important conversations because others don't trust them to handle difficult truths. Approval seeking also creates what psychologists call relational inequality. You position yourself as less important than others by constantly prioritizing their comfort over your own authenticity. This inequality makes others uncomfortable because healthy relationships require mutual respect and reciprocity. When you consistently undervalue yourself, others begin to undervalue you as well, not out of cruelty, but because you've trained them to see you as less significant. The manipulation aspect of approval seeking, even when unconscious, triggers what researchers call psychological reactance in others. When people sense they're being managed or manipulated, even for benevolent purposes, they instinctively resist and rebel. The harder you work to control their impression of you, the more likely they are to form negative impressions. The more carefully you manage your image, the more artificial and untrustworthy you appear. This paradox extends to professional and social contexts as well. The employee who never disagrees or offers contrary perspectives gets overlooked for leadership positions because their judgment can't be trusted. The friend who always says yes to everything never gets invited to activities that require genuine enthusiasm because their responses feel obligatory rather than authentic. The romantic partner who never expresses needs or preferences becomes boring because there's no real person to connect with. The most devastating aspect of this paradox is how it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your fear of rejection drives you to behave in ways that make rejection more likely. Your anxiety about disapproval causes you to act in ways that generate disapproval. Your terror of abandonment leads you to behave in ways that make others want to distance themselves from you. But the paradox goes even deeper. The approval you do receive feels meaningless because you know it's directed toward your performance rather than your authentic self. When people approve of your carefully constructed image, you can't feel satisfied because you know they're not really approving of you. This creates a psychological trap where you desperately seek approval while simultaneously being unable to receive it in any meaningful way. The journey from approval dependency to authentic freedom isn't about learning not to care what others think. It's about developing such a strong relationship with yourself that external validation becomes secondary to internal alignment. This transformation requires recognizing that the very strategies you've used to gain acceptance have prevented you from experiencing genuine connection. The first step in breaking free from validation seeking is developing what psychologists call emotional self-awareness, the ability to identify and honor your authentic feelings, thoughts, and desires without immediately calculating how others will respond to them. This means learning to pause between stimulus and response, creating space to ask yourself what you actually think or feel before considering what you should think or feel. Carl Rogers' research on authentic living revealed that psychological health comes from what he called congruence, the alignment between your inner experience and outer expression. This alignment requires developing tolerance for the discomfort that comes with being genuine, especially when your authenticity creates tension, conflict, or disappointment in others. The practice of emotional congruence begins with small acts of authenticity in low-stakes situations. Express a genuine preference about where to eat lunch. Share an actual opinion about a movie instead of mirroring what others have said. Admit when you don't know something instead of pretending to understand. Allow others to see your real reactions instead of performing the reactions you think they want to see. Karen Horney's clinical work showed that breaking free from neurotic needs requires what she called self-analysis, the honest examination of your own motivations, fears, and patterns. This means developing the courage to ask yourself uncomfortable questions. Am I helping this person because I care about them, or because I need them to see me as helpful? Am I agreeing because I genuinely agree, or because I'm afraid of conflict? Am I sharing this accomplishment to connect with others or to gain their admiration? The transformation also requires developing what researchers call distress tolerance, the ability to experience anxiety, disappointment, or disapproval without immediately acting to eliminate these uncomfortable feelings. This means learning to sit with the discomfort of someone being upset with you without rushing to fix the relationship. It means tolerating the anxiety of not knowing what others think of you without seeking reassurance or clarification. Authentic living demands that you develop your own internal validation system, a set of values, standards, and measures of worth that come from within rather than from external sources. This internal compass allows you to evaluate your choices based on whether they align with your authentic self, rather than whether they gain others' approval. You begin to ask, is this true to who I am? Instead of, will this make others happy with me? The most challenging aspect of this transformation is learning to tolerate the temporary increase in conflict and discomfort that comes with authenticity. When you stop managing others' emotions and start expressing your genuine self, some people will be disappointed, confused, or even angry. But this discomfort is the price of freedom, and it's temporary. The people who can't handle your authenticity were never really connected to you anyway. Breaking free from approval dependency also requires grieving the loss of your false self, the carefully constructed persona that gained you acceptance but cost you your soul. This grief is necessary because you're letting go of strategies that provided security, even if that security was ultimately illusory. You're choosing the uncertainty of authentic living over the false certainty of people-pleasing. The rewards of this transformation are profound. You discover that authentic connection is possible when you stop hiding who you are. You find that the right people are attracted to your genuine self, rather than your performed self. You experience the relief of no longer having to maintain exhausting personas. You develop resilience because your sense of worth is no longer dependent on external validation. The hunger for approval has stolen more than your freedom. It has stolen your very sense of self. Every time you shaped your words to avoid disapproval, every moment you suppressed your authentic reactions to maintain harmony, every choice you made based on others' expectations rather than your own truth, you handed over another piece of your soul to the insatiable god of external validation. But here's what Karen Horney knew, what Carl Jung understood, what research confirms. The very thing you've been seeking through approval, love, connection, belonging, is only possible when you stop seeking it through performance and start offering it through authenticity. The relationships built on your false self are ultimately hollow because nobody is really connecting with you. They're connecting with a character you've created to gain their acceptance. The tragedy of approval dependency isn't just that it fails to deliver genuine connection. It's that it prevents you from discovering what genuine connection actually feels like. When you're always managing impressions, you never get to experience the profound relief of being known and accepted for who you actually are. When you're constantly performing, you never get to rest in the comfort of relationships that don't require endless emotional labor. The chains of approval seeking are invisible but unbreakable until you realize that you forged them yourself and you hold the key to your own freedom. Every moment you choose authenticity over approval, every time you honor your genuine feelings over others' comfort, every decision you make based on internal alignment rather than external validation, you reclaim another piece of your authentic self. The people who matter won't mind your authenticity, and the people who mind don't matter. This isn't just a comforting platitude, it's a fundamental truth about human connection. The individuals who reject your genuine self were never really in relationship with you anyway. They were in relationship with your performance, and that performance was exhausting to maintain and empty to receive. The world doesn't need another person desperately seeking approval while hiding their authentic self. The world needs someone brave enough to be real, honest enough to be vulnerable, and strong enough to choose truth over acceptance. When you stop seeking approval and start living authentically, you give others permission to do the same. Your freedom becomes an invitation for others to find their own. But here's the final truth that will either liberate you or terrify you. Approval is infinite, but time is not. Every day you spend performing for others' validation is a day you don't get back. Every year you invest in maintaining false personas is a year stolen from living as your authentic self. Every decade you sacrifice to the god of approval is a decade you'll never recover. The question isn't whether you can afford to stop seeking approval, the question is whether you can afford not to. Because the cost of authenticity is temporary discomfort, but the cost of approval seeking is your entire life. The price of being real is occasional rejection, but the price of being fake is permanent disconnection from yourself and others. Right now, someone watching this is ready to choose freedom over approval, authenticity over acceptance, truth over comfort. They're tired of being a stranger to themselves. They're exhausted from maintaining personas that never feel quite right. They're ready to risk temporary discomfort for permanent liberation. If that's you, if you've recognized yourself in every word of this exploration, if you're ready to stop performing and start being, then you need to understand something crucial. This awakening is just the beginning. Because once you see how approval seeking has shaped every aspect of your life, you'll start noticing it everywhere. In your career choices, your relationships, your daily habits, even in your thoughts when you think no one is listening. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you imagine. The programming runs more systematically than you realize. The liberation requires more courage than you think you have, but also delivers more freedom than you can currently conceive. Subscribe if you're ready to go all the way down this path of psychological liberation. Because understanding approval dependency is just the first step toward reclaiming your authentic life. What comes next will show you how this same pattern operates in every system around you. Your family, your workplace, your community, your culture. And once you see the full scope of how approval seeking shapes human behavior, you'll never be able to unsee it. The revolution begins when you stop seeking permission to be yourself and start being yourself, regardless of who gives permission. Click subscribe if you're ready to join the ranks of people who choose authenticity over approval, freedom over acceptance, truth over comfort. Your real life is waiting for you to stop performing and start living it.